Hey everyone, in this video I'm going to look at Broadcom and AMD and answer which one I think is the better stock to buy today. I'm going to compare these two tech stocks on revenue, on profit margin, on cash flow, on valuation, and their prospects over the next couple of years, and determine which one makes the better investment today. So without further ado, let's jump in. Let's take a look at these two excellent growth stocks.
I want to thank the Motley Fool for sponsoring this video. Visit fool.com/Parkev for the 10 best stocks to buy now.
All right, starting first with revenue, you see Broadcom has grown very nicely to 35.82 billion in revenue over the last decade. Of course, if you've been following Broadcom, you've known that the company has made some big acquisitions, and that's helping revenue growth because you're including that acquired company's revenue along with your own company revenue. AMD also has made a few acquisitions in the last decade, 22.68 billion in revenue in its trailing 12 months, a little bit behind Broadcom in terms of growth in revenue, although AMD's prospects look excellent over the next 3 years, fueled by the rising demand from artificial intelligence, which we'll look at in a little bit. So the next thing I wanted to compare these two on is operating profit margin. And in this metric, Broadcom with a significant advantage at 45.93% compared to just 1.77% for AMD. If you look back the last decade, they were much closer in terms of operating profit margin. However, AMD struggled in a year and a half because of the oversupply of GPU chips, oversupply of CPU chips, and oversupply of inventory overall in the broader semiconductor industry. There was a sharp reversal in consumer demand when economies reopened, and these companies were caught off guard with a quick change in consumer behavior, shifting from buying things to buying services, and that hurt companies like AMD, like Intel, and others who were selling products into that channel inventory. So that was not a good sign, but now it's recovering. I wouldn't be surprised if the company's operating profit margin retreats back up to 20% and even higher over the next 2 to 4 years. In fact, let's look at the next 2 to 3 years for each of these two companies. If you look at Broadcom here, which if you look at its revenue growth expectations, you can see 39.6% revenue growth expected in fiscal year 2024, which ends in October for Broadcom, and 10% earnings per share expected for this company. In 2025, it's expected to grow revenue by 11% and earnings per share by 20%. And then in 2026, 8.6% revenue growth and 11.3% earnings per share growth. Solid growth prospects to be sure, and all reasons why investors are happy with Broadcom stock. The company has performed well in terms of business performance. When we look at AMD, it has significantly better prospects than Broadcom over the next 3 years. Revenue growth in 2024 expected at 13.7%, with earnings per share growth of 36.4% expected. For 2025, 26% revenue growth expected, with 51% earnings per share growth expected. And then for 2026, another 22% revenue growth expected, with 32% earnings per share growth expected. So both companies have excellent prospects going forward for the next few years, although AMD has much better prospects, as I mentioned already, due to the rising effectiveness of artificial intelligence and its new GPU coming out that's proven to have strong consumer demand. It's going to rise to rival that of NVIDIA. Of course, NVIDIA is arguably at least one step, maybe 2 steps ahead of all of the competition in terms of AI GPUs. AMD, however, has closed the gap before to NVIDIA in terms of gaming chips. I wouldn't be surprised if AMD closes the gap again to NVIDIA. Now, I'm not saying it's gonna close the gap completely. I'm just saying that gap, although it's really wide right now, it's likely to narrow over the next few years as AMD launches its products into the market. The next thing I wanted to look at and compare these two on is cash flow from operations. And again, you could see Broadcom significantly ahead of AMD at 50% compared to 7.35% for AMD. Although again, I do expect this gap to narrow over the next few years, given that AMD's prospects are much better than Broadcom's prospects. This gap is likely to narrow. And finally, I wanted to compare these two on valuation. And if we look on a forward price to earnings basis, Broadcom is trading at a forward PE of 22, whereas AMD is trading at a forward PE of 30. Interestingly, I have both of these stocks rated as a buy. I like both of these investments. So in this video, I'm picking between these two, but I have both of them rated as a buy. I like both of them. As we've seen across the board, the metrics look strong for both of these two, and they've got solid prospects over the next 3 years. And the valuations are not too expensive. Even a forward PE of 30 for AMD is not expensive considering its phenomenal prospects. It's got an above 30% earnings per share expectation over the next 3 years, 36.4%, 51%, and 31.8%. I always like an investment where the earnings per share growth rate is above that of the PE ratio, which we see with AMD. Now, Broadcom also has excellent prospects, but not as strong as AMD. 10% earnings per share growth expected in 2024. That's below its price to earnings forward ratio. Also in 2025, 20.4% earnings per share growth expected, again below its price to earnings forward ratio. And then even in 2026, 11.3% below its valuation ratio. Whereas AMD, all three growth rates for the next 3 years are above its forward price to earnings ratio. So I guess you could kind of see where I'm going with this. Both of them are excellent stocks, excellent prospects. But if I had to pick one of these two, I would pick AMD. I would pick AMD because, namely, its excellent prospects over the next 3 years. Now, if you look backwards, then Broadcom clearly looks like the better company, right? We saw the cash flow from operations way ahead of AMD. We saw the operating profit margin also way ahead of AMD. But when you look forward and you look at the expectations and what analysts are anticipating from AMD, you can see that it's going to close the gap relatively quickly in this regard. Maybe not all the way close the gap, but certainly close the gap to some degree, as it's going to grow at a rate at least twice that of Broadcom over the next 2 to 3 years, given the rising effectiveness of AI. So for all those reasons, if I was to pick one of these two, I would pick AMD, but I like both of these stocks. I have both of them rated as a buy. It's just I like AMD a tad bit more than I like Broadcom, so I would pick Broadcom as the better stock to buy between these two. Before I let you go, let me tell you about the greatest deal on YouTube. With just a click of a button, you can get free financial analysis from a professor with decades of investing experience. So what are you waiting for? Hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you again soon.